Nathan, I appreciate your time. I'm grateful for you for joining the podcast. Can you introduce yourself and let everyone know what your area of expertise is?
Yeah, sure. My name's Nathan Donley. I'm the Environmental Health Science Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. And the Center for Biological Diversity is a national nonprofit dedicated to protecting life on Earth. And I work, as I said, in our environmental health program, which focuses on chemical contaminants in the environment, things like air and water pollutants, pesticides, other toxicants that can impact our health and the health of the environment. My background is in toxicology. I worked for a while doing cancer research in academia, and now focus on mainly pesticide policy and regulation in the United States.
How long have you been focusing on that?
It's been about 8 years now. So, I've developed a good knowledge base.
When you started the work, and I mean, compared to what you're looking at now, does it really surprise you with new learnings that you're seeing every time that you discover something new?
Yeah. In some ways, ignorance is bliss, as they say. I feel like I know too much now, and it makes me a little neurotic, and sometimes a bit depressed. But you gotta face the bad stuff sometimes in order to help turn things around. And so, sometimes I feel like I'm more productive than others, but it's been a slog sometimes, for sure.
What do you do on a daily basis, and how do you grocery shop, you and your family, knowing how contaminated our food system is? What are some of the things that you do personally?
Yeah, well, I would say I have the privilege of being able to have access to and to be able to afford organic food. So that's something I certainly strive to do when I can, but also recognize that not everyone has that privilege. And so, the focus really on our work is to try and make, to not only advocate for better growing practices across the country, but increase the safeguards to make sure that everyone has access to safe food, not just people who can afford it.
Is organic I guess the idea of organic is that it's not sprayed and it's not contaminated. Is that actually true?
Well, some organic growers use organic pesticides. So organic pesticides are things that occur naturally. Things like pyrethrins, which come from chrysanthemum flowers, things like sulfur, which is a naturally occurring substance that can cut down on insect and fungi that can harm crops. But by and large, organic practices do not use pesticides, and the ones they do use are orders of magnitude safer than some of these synthetic ones that quote unquote conventional agriculture uses quite commonly. So the USDA organic label is actually very strong, and is one of the few labels that actually means anything. If you go to the grocery store and the product you buy says all natural or green or healthy, those are meaningless terms. They're not subject to any type of regulation and are often used in greenwashing by companies to try and get you to think that their product is grown in a much more sustainable manner than it actually is.
Yeah, the term greenwashing, I've heard so much lately. Is that a new term, or has that been around for a long time?
Yeah, it's been around. It's been around for a long time, but it's really ramped up in use as people's awareness has grown of, just how bad some of these things are. They're on store shelves, and so people are trying to make healthier decisions for themselves and their families by buying things that are natural and don't harm the environment as much and are much safer for us to ingest or have around our homes. And companies have globbed onto that and basically tried to convince you through either their packaging or the names of their products that it's safe or natural, when in many cases it's not. So it's really these company practices are coming in response to people wanting to make healthier decisions. And then, of course, it makes it so hard when you go to the store and you're bombarded with all this misinformation often. How are you supposed to make the right decisions for yourself and your family? It's incredibly tough.
Yeah, as a consumer who, just going to work and you got family to raise, if like kind of like you said in the beginning, ignorance is bliss, and if you don't know about it, then you don't really worry about it. But for me, when I talk to people like you, I get off and I'm already like a glass is half empty kind of person already. So I look at the world in a particularly mostly negative lens sometimes, which is not always healthy. But yeah, man, it seems like we're at a point of no return almost when it comes to agriculture and these pesticides. And when you compare legislation from the United States with the UK and Europe, those countries aren't perfect, but they're a lot more stringent on what chemicals can be used in cosmetics and food additives too. Have you seen much progress in the United States since you started working in this field?
Yeah, there's been there's been little progress, I would say, on the federal end. Some states are making much greater progress than the federal government, which of course is good for people in those states, but it also sets up this dichotomy of some people are better protected in the U.S. than others, which is not something we want. So it's important to see the federal government step up and provide some a minimum floor that everyone has to meet. And that's, as Congress is completely broken. And when you have zero chance of getting any legislation through, and you have, it being incredibly difficult for even a progressive administration to do a lot of things, then, it's just, progress is just baby steps, which can be so tough to see because we need to make progress quickly, right. And it just doesn't happen that way, unfortunately.
So what are some of the major chemicals that you see that are being used, and how are they harming humans?
Yeah, this is there's a lot. I would say on the pesticide side of things, the most widely used pesticide, which is actually an herbicide, but we lump it into the larger pesticide umbrella, is a pesticide called glyphosate, which has been used for quite some time, but its use really ramped up with the advent of genetically engineered crops, to where the crop has been genetically engineered to a certain extent, and you can actually spray glyphosate on top of the crop without killing it, and it'll kill the weeds in the field. And so this really gained popularity in the 1990s and is basically being used on most commodity crops right now. So commodity crops are things like corn and soybeans and wheat and rice, sort of the main staples for a lot of people. And glyphosate was in 2015 identified as a possible human carcinogen, probable human carcinogen. And everyone up till then thought it was completely safe because that's how it had been marketed. And that was just the narrative that Monsanto, who made glyphosate at the time, spun it. So glyphosate's a big one. It's on a lot of food that we eat. There are other herbicides, things like 2,4-D, which is one of the few components in the herbicide Agent Orange that was used in the Vietnam War. And there's other things like neonicotinoids, which are insecticides used to kill insect pests in crops, but are systemic. So they actually get taken up into the root system of the plant and distributed throughout the plant. So it's these pesticides are just as much of the food that you eat as the vitamins that are actually in the food, which is worrisome because you can't wash it off. You can't do anything. You just eat what's in there. So these are worrisome. Another chemical class, these aren't pesticides, but PFAS, which are termed so-called forever chemicals. Many of your listeners may have heard of them. They're in the news quite often now. So these are incredibly worrisome chemicals that are incredibly persistent. You know, the PFAS we put into the environment today will probably be around for the birth of my grandchildren's grandchildren. I mean, that's the length of time we're talking about here. And they're associated with all sorts of negative health harms, things like cancer, hormone disruption, immune dysfunction, so things like decreased response to vaccines, high cholesterol, obesity. So PFAS are considered what are called obesogens, which are molecules that interfere with weight regulation, and they can alter metabolism. They can interfere with the regulation of your appetite and how full you feel after a meal, things like that. And it's so sad that for a century now, individuals really have been blamed for being overweight because it's been thought that the only thing contributing to weight gain is personal choice, things like what you eat and how often you eat. And those things are certainly important, but they're not telling the whole story. And for some individuals, weight gain is beyond their control to a certain extent. It's really been kind of hijacked by largely unregulated chemicals that we really have no choice but to be exposed to. So PFAS are really high up there and worries for me, but there are also some pesticides as well.
It's mind-boggling just listening to you talk, and if we know from the scientific community that these chemicals are harmful, and there's study after study showing that they're harmful, how do companies get away with still using it? I don't understand that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really all about power. These are very big companies that make a lot of money for very powerful people. They employ a lot of people too. And so, they play it up as if these chemicals go away, people will be out of work, and there's going to be like this mass, we're going to go back to the Great Depression type thing. And so they use scare tactics to basically gin up support for the products that they sell, even though we know that in many cases they're dangerous. When as a politician or a decision maker, if you're worried that a decision you make might, like have people lose their jobs or somehow tank the economy, you're not going to make the right decision. You're going to be making your decision out of fear instead of in a place of empowerment that is based in the knowledge of science. So that's sort of how it goes. And of course, political contributions to certain candidates, it's all a game now. It really is, and it's tough to see because science doesn't mean what it used to, unfortunately, and it's really the only way we have to get fact-based information is to study these things. But when you're a scientist and you're screaming from the top of your lungs that these things are causing harm to society, and you're seeing no movement from leadership, it can be really, it can really make you just sort of question why you're even doing it in the first place.
Well, even some studies are paid for by these large corporations. There's this website. It's a pretty prominent one. I forget what it is now off the top of my head, but they released a study that showed glyphosate to be harmless to humans. And then, so it was it's a nonprofit. So they had their donors for it. And the list of donors in 2022 was Bayer, who owns Monsanto's or glyphosate. And that was their like top 3 contributor, which is like wild. Like, I don't know how they could put that out with there's a lot of corruption there, obviously.
Yeah, there is. And there's enormous conflicts of interest as well. I mean, if you're getting paid by the company whose product you're studying, if you find that product's harmful, guess who's not paying you the next time you need money to study? So, it sets up a conflict where you're really incentivized to find that these products are safe. And actually, this is very common on the pesticide side of things and regulation. A lot of people think that when the EPA looks at pesticides, that they're studying the pesticides, and the EPA scientists are the ones doing the experiments and making sure everything's safe. But that's not the case. It's the companies that are doing the experiments
Right.
and submitting them to EPA. This is actually enshrined in our law that the companies do the experiments, submit them to EPA, and then EPA takes a look and says, okay, this is safe, or, or not. And so the companies really control the science. And the reason that's in place is because these experiments are incredibly expensive. Some of these experiments, these long-term experiments with animals can be, $1 to $2 million a pop. And a lot of times for pesticide registration, they're submitting 40, 50 experiments. I mean, it adds up real quickly. And so, when regulators were first figuring out how to do this, no one wanted to put this on the taxpayer to pay for, which is if EPA did the experiments, that's who'd be paying for it, would be us. So they said, there's only one entity here who has the money to perform these experiments other than the government, and that's the industry. And so the industry said, okay, we'll do the experiments. $50 million is nothing to them. And if they get to control the science, they control the narrative, they control everything. So they're happy to spend the money to do these experiments because they control what comes out of them. And, sometimes EPA can say, well, we don't like the methodology you did. And they can come to their own interpretations of the studies. But when the study is done by the company and they've told you what they think it means, right, they've already sort of had the narrative that's the narrative that goes forward. And so EPA is really, they don't have as much power here as they think they do. And this is an enormous problem in pesticides because, it's been shown time and time again that when the companies pay for these experiments, they tend to find that the products are much safer than when independent researchers like from academia study them, Right. And so it sets up to where risk is being underestimated and these things are being assumed to be much safer than they actually are.
That one phrase that always makes me laugh too is in small amounts it's not harmful. Like I don't even I wouldn't drink bleach because that's toxic, that's bad for me. So to me, a little bit of toxin is really bad. And the term that gets thrown around is what is it? Grass or generally recognized as safe. That's wild to me. It's just a little bit of poison for you. It's not a lot. It's just a little bit, and it's safe for you.
Yeah, and again, this is it sort of goes to what we can and can't show with different science experiments. Just because in one experiment a lower dose didn't have an effect doesn't mean that that's the case. These experiments need to be reproduced. They need to be looked at. Just because a low dose didn't have an effect on a rat doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to have an effect on a human. And so, we're really, unfortunately, even though there's a lot of studies out there on pesticides, we're still really kind of limited in what we actually know. And even more important than that is that what happens if we're exposed to a low dose of 20 different chemicals at a time, which is actually very common. It is very rare to be exposed to a single chemical at a time because they're so pervasive in our environment. Even pesticide products often have 20, 30, 50 different ingredients in there, even though there's only one that is actually the pesticide that kills what you're targeting. There's all sorts of other additives in there and stuff like that. So when you're exposed to these things, you're exposed to 50 different things at a time. And these experiments that are being done on the regulatory side are really only looking at how exposure to one of those components is harming you. And it's really, the mixture side of things, how we get exposed to mixtures, how they can affect our health is really underappreciated, particularly in the regulatory sphere. And we just don't know anything about it, unfortunately. And it's leading to a ton of uncertainty and ultimately, probably harm out in the real world.
Yeah, you make a good point too. So it's not just what you consume, but it's also what people are putting on our bodies and our cosmetics, because it's all environmental, right? I think, sometimes I get wrapped up into only focusing on food, but there's the forever chemicals and shampoos, Arm deodorant has, aluminum, parabens, all that crap in there. So we're getting exposed to toxins at an alarming rate every day.
Yeah. And what's happening when, our bodies are being bombarded by 50 different things at the same time? No one knows.
Yeah.
And, for some people, it may totally be fine. For other people who happen to have a genetic predisposition, or who have, a suboptimal diet, or who don't get as much exercise, or who are exposed to high levels of air pollution, they may be much more sensitive to a chemical exposure than the general population. So the regulations are really designed in some ways to keep people ignorant of that fact,
Right.
and say, well, if you're exposed to glyphosate at this level, it's safe. But how about when you're exposed to that in combination with everything else we're already exposed to? No one has the answer to that.
And it doesn't, like, one of the problems too is I think people think that you can just wash it off, rinse it off, or soak it in vinegar and remove toxins when you're buying your fruit and vegetables. But it's got to be degrading the soil too over time. So it's our crops and our food are just constantly being exposed to those chemicals. So it's those plants are growing with those toxins inside of them, right?
In some cases, yeah, for pesticides that are systemic, they actually get into the plant tissues. They're not just sort of coating the plant in a residue. Some pesticides are, but many now are systemic. So they just make their way into the plant. And then, depending on how long they stay in the plant before being metabolized, people can actually absolutely be exposed to them. You can't wash those residues off. Whatever you eat goes into your body. And then that whatever you eat is going to be combined with however much of that pesticide you're also exposed to in your water, because water is a major source of pesticide exposure. And then if you apply pesticides around the home, or if you rent a place and your landlord applies pesticides around the home, a lot of people don't have control over what pesticides are applied in their home. Then that's another added exposure scenario. If you live in rural America near a farm, the springtime when the spraying occurs, there's an added exposure scenario. So add all those together, and that's your cumulative exposure. It can get pretty high.
That's wild. What is the reception like when, I think this one article that I reached out to you was I think you were quoted in The Guardian. What is the reception like from people when studies like this come out?
Yeah, frustration, like how on earth can, one of the richest countries in the world allow this to happen? How is this not being addressed? And so I think for a long time there's just been this trust, and this trust in the system that the regulatory system was working, and we were all being protected. And anything you buy at the store, someone has looked over and said, this is safe. And I think for a while there, that was the case. But industry has been incredibly successful in sort of infiltrating some of these regulatory agencies and eroding the safeguards that we have in place over time, to the point where people's perception of what regulation and oversight of chemicals in this country is very different than the reality. And that frustrates people. That makes people angry. They're like, why do we even have this? Why do we have this enormous regulatory infrastructure in place in this country, and yet it's not protecting people the way we expect it to? And it's frustrating. And the one thing I always get asked is like, well, should we just ditch the whole thing? And I hope that's not the message that your listeners come away with. It's that, it's not that we don't need any regulation at all in this country. It's that we need much, much stronger regulation. We need greater firewalls in place to separate the regulated industry from the regulators, to make sure there's no undue influence in there, and that government employees who are, largely, just citizens like we are who want to do good work and want to protect people are allowed to do that without political interference or without, industry coming in and schmoozing their way into getting what they want.
Hmm. Have you ever been tapped on the shoulder by someone from the industry and been like, "Hey, you're talking too much, dude. Shut the hell up." What about the reception from like chemical or companies within the industry?
Yeah, they've largely ignored me to this point. Thankfully, a lot of my colleagues have not had that benefit. It can be tough when you're a scientist. You know, finding things or making statements that are in opposition to what industry, the sort of narrative they want to spin. And I mean, there was a website up for a while. I think it was fronted by Monsanto that it was called Science Deniers for Hire. And they put a spot on me in there and some of my colleagues. And it's all just scare tactics. They try to assassinate your character. They try and take you down and make you seem like some sort of crazy, person who doesn't know anything, who's just this ideologue and is not really a true scientist. But you just got to brush it off and say, screw them. I'm doing work that I'm very proud of. And but it can be kind of, especially if you're in academia. I think I'm in the nonprofit world. And so I think it affects me less. But if you're in academia and you're reliant on grants and you're reliant on your reputation as, someone who is just basically this unbiased vessel that you just, you do your science and explain the results, then I think it can just be a little tougher for people in that situation to sit there and take all this misinformation from industry trying to tear them down.
Your nonprofit that you're associated with, does the organization focus like environmental toxins only, or what other kind of work do y'all do?
No, we kind of do the whole gamut. So I work in our environmental health program. This is one of about 10 programs we have. Another one is oceans program. So looking at ocean health, a lot of that has to do with plastics in the environment, which largely end up in water bodies. We've got a climate change program focusing on the climate crisis that we're currently living in. We also started as an endangered species conservation organization. So we have a big endangered species program looking at, there's about 1,700 endangered species in the United States that are, at risk of going extinct. And species are going extinct throughout the world all the time. And those are species we're never going to see again. Once they're gone, they're gone. You can't bring them back. And so our goal is to try and get protections for species that are declining due to, all sorts of reasons, habitat loss, chemical exposures, stuff like that. We also have a population sustainability program looking at overpopulation in the US and some of the effects that can have. So we really try and get our fingers in every single potential way that humans are harming the environment, because it's a monster. I mean, there's a lot going on here and a lot that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's all connected, though, when you look at the work you're doing and with like climate change, because agriculture plays into climate change, and overpopulation. Is that a true thing? Are we overpopulated?
We are beyond our carrying capacity. It's not maybe necessarily that we're overpopulated. It's that there are some places in the country that use way, way, way more resources than we have available to us. So, while the U.S. has less of a population than some other countries around the world, we're a richer nation, and we buy more things, and we use more things, and we extract more things from the environment, and our environmental footprint is really, really bad. And so it's a problem that kind of keeps getting worse. but one that, with proper education, people understand that, we gotta act within our means, and being more sustainable in our choices, and having, things like reducing our carbon footprint. These are things that we've all got to do.
Hmm. Yeah, the plastic. I've read that there's a global plastics treaty that's being formed with the United Nations. Are y'all involved in that work?
We are,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm not personally, but I know our organization has been involved in that to some extent. Yeah, single-use plastics it's just getting out of control. I mean, it's to the point where you can't buy anything anymore without a ton of excess packaging that is just not needed. And we can't recycle plastics. I mean, technically you can, but it just doesn't happen. And so, plastic is garbage.
Yeah.
Anything you buy, anything, that's in the package of something you buy, it's just garbage, and it doesn't really degrade in any meaningful time scale. And so, finding ways to reduce our use of that is absolutely vital moving forward.
Yeah, I talked to I forget the gentleman's name, but he was part of the global plastics treaty, and he said something that I hadn't heard before, that the only way that you could really recycle plastic is that if all the plastic is made up of the same type of material. And that's why we can't recycle it right now, because like Ozarka water bottles may be made up of a different type of plastics than Dasani water bottles. So and the way the chemicals they use to color the lids and the bottles, like, it's not truly recyclable like we think we are. And I never heard of that before. I thought a water bottle was a water bottle and it's recyclable.
Yeah, it's really bad. And the reason everyone thinks plastics are recyclable is because they have a recycling symbol on them,
Yeah.
which is ridiculous because they can't be recycled. And honestly, the few instances where plastics can be recycled, they're done so in really very polluting facilities. It releases a lot of pollution, to recycle these plastics, because they have so many gnarly additives in them that when you're melting things down, things get released. And often this is happening in fence line communities, in low income communities with a high proportion of people of color. These neighborhoods are targeted for these facilities because those communities, those neighborhoods don't have much political clout. And so it's leading to, a situation where the most vulnerable among us are being disproportionately impacted by our addiction to plastics. And even those of us who have good intentions, I still try and put a few plastics in my recycling bin that are allowed in there. But a lot of times, just recycling plastics is just a gnarly process, and it just really doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just so convenient. I don't know, and I don't know how we would stop using plastic, because plastic water bottles, plastic bags, like Ziploc bags, everything is just real convenient for us.
I know, and we've gotten used to it, and that's the problem. Is once you've gotten used to something, that becomes the new norm. I mean, most people were living without plastics in the 1950s just fine. People were raising their families, and obviously plastics have in some ways given us a little bit better of a quality of life, in that some things, are more sterile. We have access to some other things that can help us in our daily lives, but it comes at a cost. And that cost often isn't factored in when thinking about some of the benefits that plastics give us. And when you add in some of the costs, some plastics might still have more benefits than costs, but a lot of others really don't. And it's hard for individuals to sort of contemplate that. It really needs to be done on a societal level. And that's currently not happening.
If you could wave your magic wand, what is one of the key areas that you would focus on, whether it's plastics or toxic chemicals or PFAS? Like, what is the first thing you would do to make a positive impact?
Ooh, yeah, that's a really good question. Gosh, I haven't even thought about that. Well, I think, the climate crisis is the defining issue of our generation, and will be moving forward. So that's something I would tackle. But working in the chemicals realm, yeah, I would say just a better regulatory system. We need better laws. We need a regulatory system that is detached from industry, because a good, robust regulatory system works. I mean, we've seen it work in Europe. Europe has an enormous agricultural sector, much bigger than the U.S. When you talk about money coming in, what is it, 30 or so countries now in the European Union. So they can make agriculture work with much tighter regulations on agrochemicals. And we just haven't gone there yet because there's just no desire to take this on. In general, the American public don't really have an awareness of this issue the way the European public does. And I think politicians really sort of write on that and say, well, my constituents don't care. I'm just going to do X, Y, and Z. But I think if you ask people on the street, do chemicals in your food, do chemicals in the environment bother you? Most of the time, most of the answers you'll hear is yes. Those issues just really aren't covered in the media here, and they're just not in the public awareness as they are in the European Union. And so, there needs to be an understanding that people in this country want food that's free of poisons. They want to breathe clean air and they want to drink clean water. And making that happen, I think, it would take a lot of political capital. Unfortunately, you'd have to take on extremely powerful industries that can fund your political opponent 50 times higher than you're being funded. And so, seeing some of the sort of impact of political contributions and things coming through super PACs hopefully can be taken away as well.
Do you think a rise in consumer awareness and community could help push that change more and even be stronger than the political PACs and the donors? And I don't think enough. I think, like you said, I think people care, but we're all so busy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's almost like the system is made up to keep us busy so they can just keep doing it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you turn on the television, you've got 10,000 different things to watch.
Yeah.
So the distraction level's high. And you're right, people are busy. People are working hard and they come home and they've got families to take care of. And so, I have the benefit of being able to study this stuff for my job. And so I'm able to stay up to date on it. And I have a knowledge base that not a lot of people have, because not a lot of people have time to do this. If you're not getting paid to be up to date on this stuff, you're not going to do it. You've got other things you got to do. You've got another job. You got your family to take care of. So you're right. I mean, it's a lot. And chemicals being poorly regulated is one of 1,000 dumpster fires that we're trying to put out in this country right now. I mean, there's so much going on. And it's almost overwhelming. And I think people, rightfully so, and I do this as well sometimes, is that, after a long day of work, after putting the kids to bed, you just want to watch a mindless show on TV instead of think about some of the real problems we have. And I totally understand that.
Yeah. I have coworkers. I work for a large corporation, and I have coworkers that sit in Europe and the UK, and their work-life balance is a lot different, and how they operate on a weekly basis and how they treat kids, like how parents treat kids in other countries compared to like how we normally think of kids in the United States on a broad scale. It's like, oh, kids are kind of like, they're kind of a pain in the butt. Like, but in the other countries that I find out, like, parents like welcome kids. They're always part of the activities. Like, there's never like a separation between like the adults and the kids. Like, that's all one. And that's just like one of the differences that I've seen. And those other countries have better regulations. It seems like those countries' governments care a little bit more about the toxins and the additives that are in foods. So a partly like one aspect of it in my mind is just how our work-life balance is, and they have more time to care about those things than we do.
Absolutely. Their employers are mandated to give them vacation time, sick time. Um, you know, and oftentimes here we're working 50-hour weeks. And of course, if you're working that much, you don't have time to think about anything else. But if you have time to get away from your job, to get away from the grind, then you can start thinking about these things a little better. Um, you have time to educate yourself. You have time to volunteer for organizations and go. You have time off work to vote. I mean, people here sometimes. I mean, even if you want to go and vote, it's hard to get away from your job to even do that. And you're right; it's the system's kind of designed to keep people siloed in that world and not think about some of these bigger problems that we face.
Yeah. Do your friends and family get tired of hearing you talk about nasty chemicals? Do you think you're kind of like a witch doctor? Like, all right, dude, all right, we've had enough of this. You can stop talking about it.
Yeah, there's sort of two frames of mind I found. Some people are just like, you're such a downer. Like, I can't listen to you anymore. Just shut up. And others are like, want to know things in so much detail. And I'm the one who's like, listen, I just got off work thinking about this stuff for 10 hours. I don't want to talk about it right now,
Yeah.
So it's really interesting at how sort of different people think about these issues and different levels that they kind of care about them, because it really varies from person to person.
Yeah. My family, so I'm obviously not educated in what I just talk to people who are experts like you, and then I regurgitate to my friends and family. I'm like, oh my God. So when I get off the phone, I'm probably going to tell my wife, oh my God, Nathan said blah, 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 blah. And then I tell my family when I go see them. So I don't like microwave my stuff in plastic. I don't cook on Teflon coated stuff anymore. Like I only, stuff like that. And my parents just think I'm cuckoo. They're like, we've been doing that. Like one response is like, we've been doing this our whole lives and we're alive. We're fine. And I'm just like, okay, well, you're going to die. So I don't know, man. My family thinks I'm crazy. So I can only imagine you being an expert, like what they think about you.
Yeah. I think like our parents' generation, the baby boomers kind of, things are just different for them. There's a trust that everything's okay. And there's an idea that, well, I've done it for my entire life and I'm just fine. But then when you talk to them, you're like, you have like 10 health complaints you've told me about today. Like, are you really doing fine?
Yeah.
It's sort of human nature to just be like, you know, well, put hair on your chest, and this is the way we've always done it, and hopefully, as the younger generations sort of come and take over things a little bit more, that sort of idea, that frame of mind is going to go away, because I think it's actually kind of, we don't need to do these things that harm us. It doesn't build character.
Right.
It just harms us. And so, yeah, well, hopefully that frame of mind, that goes away a bit.
Yeah, fully agreed. Well, how can people get involved, man, with your organization? What are, like, if your friends are itching to get involved and help make a difference, what are some of the ways that they can do it?
Yeah, as frustrating as an answer this is, the best thing you can do is vote your values. So, always vote in every election. Make sure you know what your candidates think. Vote on ballot measures. These are really important things to do. Also, vote with your pocketbook. If people keep buying garbage things are going to keep, taking up most of the store shelves. And so, I fully understand that not everyone has the means to be able to do this, but if you do, buy things that are natural, buy things that are safe, try and do a little bit of research, buy from companies that you trust, and do that. And then, of course, if you're able to, if you have the time, get involved, volunteer with different organizations. If you don't have the time, but you have the means, donate to these organizations that are you know, doing things like suing the government when it's not following the law, and making sure that our laws, while not perfect, are at the very least upheld, and our environment is being protected to a minimal extent as we can. So yeah, there's a lot of things you can do, but also, if you do research and you know about this stuff, talk to people about it. A lot of people just don't know. It's not they don't care. It's just that they're bombarded with so many things, and a lot of people do want to know about this. And you'll get people, of course, who think you're crazy and ignore you, but some people, you'll genuinely impact, and you can be helping them. You can be helping their health and their quality of life and that of their families. So just get out there and talk to your friends and family and people
All right. Awesome, man. Well, Nathan, I appreciate your time, man. I'll let you get back to your sick kiddos. You have social media or anything where people can follow you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. Forget my handle. I think it's @Nathan_Donley.
Okay.
DONLEY. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll let you know when this comes out. And like I said, I appreciate your time, Nathan.
Absolutely. It's great talking to you, Jonathan.
All right, man. You have a good one. Bye.
See you.